The scream that tore through the winter night died somewhere in Nora Jenkins' throat as her husband's fist connected with her jaw one final time. February 1882 brought the worst blizzard Goldfield Nevada had seen in a decade, and the howling wind swallowed whatever sound managed to escape her lips. Raymond Jenkins, a mean drunk on his best days and a monster on his worst, stood over her broken form in the doorway of their cabin, his eyes as cold as the snow falling around them. He had discovered the money she'd been hiding, the coins she'd saved from selling eggs and mending clothes, her only hope of escape from this hell she'd called marriage for 3 long years. "You think you can leave me?" Raymond's voice was a snarl as he grabbed her by her dark hair and dragged her outside into the freezing darkness. "You think you're worth anything without me?" Nora's vision blurred, her ribs screaming in agony from where his boots had found their mark. Blood ran warm down her face, a stark contrast to the biting cold that immediately began seeping into her bones. She tried to speak, to beg, but her split lip wouldn't form the words properly. Raymond threw her down into the snow beside their cabin, and she landed hard on her shoulder, hearing something crack. "You want to leave so bad. Then go." He kicked her once more in the stomach, and she curled into herself, gasping, "Freeze out here like the worthless thing you are." Through the haze of pain, Nora heard his footsteps crunching back toward the cabin. The door slammed, and then there was only the wind and the snow and the overwhelming cold. She tried to push herself up, but her arms wouldn't support her weight. Blood dripped onto the pristine white snow, creating dark stains that were quickly covered by fresh powder. The storm was getting worse, the temperature dropping rapidly as night deepened. She had to move, had to find shelter, but her body wouldn't obey. The cold was almost merciful now, numbing the worst of the pain as she lay there bleeding into the snowbank. Nora's thoughts drifted to her mother, dead these 5 years, who had warned her about Raymond's temper before the wedding. She'd been only 18 then, too young and too stubborn to listen. Now at 21, she was going to die in the snow outside the home she tried so desperately to escape. The world faded to white, then to nothing. Graham Tucker pulled his coat tighter around his broad shoulders and squinted into the blizzard. His horse, a sturdy Mustang named Dusty, snorted and tossed his head, clearly unhappy about being out in this weather. Graham couldn't blame him. He should have stayed at the Miller Ranch where he'd been working for the past month, but the old restlessness had come over him again. At 24, he'd been drifting from town to town for 6 years, never staying long enough to put down roots, always moving when things started feeling too permanent. "I know, boy," Graham said, patting Dusty's neck. "Bad decision. Won't be the first or the last." He'd planned to make it to the boarding house in Goldfield before the worst of the storm hit, but he'd misjudged the timing badly. Now visibility was nearly zero, and he was relying on Dusty's instincts to keep them on something resembling a path. The wind cut through his layers of clothing like a knife, and ice was forming on his beard. Dusty suddenly stopped, refusing to move forward despite Graham's urging. The horse's ears swiveled, and he let out a low whinny that sounded almost distressed. "What is it?" Graham dismounted, his boots sinking deep into the snow. He could barely make out shapes in the darkness and swirling white, but Dusty had never steered him wrong before. The horse moved forward a few steps and stopped again, pawing at something. Graham's heart nearly stopped when he saw what looked like a body half buried in the growing snowbank. He dropped to his knees beside the prone figure, brushing away snow with frantic hands. A woman, young, her face battered and covered in blood that had frozen in streaks down her cheeks. He pressed his fingers to her throat, searching for a pulse, and nearly sobbed with relief when he found one, faint and slow but there. "Madam, "Madam, can you hear me?" No response. Her skin was like ice, lips blue, eyes closed. She was barely breathing, her chest rising and falling in shallow, irregular movements. Graham looked around wildly, spotting the dark shape of a cabin about 30 yards away. Anger flooded through him as he realized what must have happened. Someone had done this to her and left her to die. He couldn't take her to that cabin, couldn't risk whoever had hurt her being inside. The boarding house was still too far, and she wouldn't survive the journey in this condition. Graham made a split-second decision. There was an old line shack about a mile back, one he'd passed on his way. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. As gently as he could, Graham lifted the woman into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, and he could feel the bones of her shoulders through her thin dress. What kind of monster put someone out in a blizzard dressed like this? He placed her carefully across Dusty's saddle, then mounted behind her, holding her against his chest to share what warmth he could. The ride to the line shack was the longest mile of Graham's life. The woman didn't stir, didn't make a sound, and he found himself talking to her, to Dusty, to the storm itself, anything to fill the terrible silence. "You're going to be fine," he said, knowing it might be a lie. "I've got you now. You're safe." The line shack materialized out of the storm like a blessing. Graham had helped repair it last summer, and he knew it would be weathertight at least. He kicked the door open and carried the woman inside, laying her on the single cot in the corner. There was a small stove, thank God, and wood stacked beside it. His hands shook as he worked to get a fire started, striking matches that kept blowing out in the drafts. Finally, blessedly, the kindling caught. Graham fed the infant flames carefully until he had a proper fire going, then turned his attention back to the woman. In the growing firelight he could see the full extent of her injuries, and his jaw clenched with fury. Her face was a mass of bruises, lips split, one eye swollen shut. The way she held her left arm suggested it might be broken or dislocated. Blood had soaked through her dress on one side. He needed to get her warm and dry, but propriety warred with necessity. Graham compromised by removing only her wet outer layers, leaving her undergarments and wrapping her in his own dry coat and the blanket from his bedroll. Her dress, he noted with disgust, was a cheap cotton thing that wouldn't have kept her warm even without the snow. There was no wedding ring on her finger, but he could see the pale line where one had been recently. Graham wet a cloth from his canteen and carefully cleaned the blood from her face. Most of it came from a gash above her eyebrow and her split lip. The head wounds always bled worst, he knew from experience, but they weren't necessarily the most dangerous. He was more worried about what injuries he couldn't see. Internal bleeding, broken bones, the cold itself. "Come on," he murmured, chafing her icy hands between his own. "Come back. You didn't survive all that just to give up now." He heated water on the stove and used it to make warm compresses, placing them on her hands and feet, being careful not to warm her too quickly. He'd seen men lose fingers and toes to frostbite when they'd been warmed too fast. All through the long night, Graham tended to her, feeding the fire, replacing the compresses and watching the shallow rise and fall of her chest. Somewhere near dawn, her breathing changed, becoming deeper and more regular. Graham, who had been dozing in the chair he'd pulled up beside the cot, jerked awake. The woman's eyelids fluttered and a small sound escaped her lips. "Easy," Graham said softly, leaning forward. "You're safe. No one's going to hurt you." Her eyes opened slowly, the one that wasn't swollen. They were a deep brown, he noticed, and filled with confusion and fear. She tried to sit up, then gasped in pain and fell back. "Don't move too quick," Graham said. "You've been hurt pretty bad. I found you in the snow last night. Do you remember what happened?" For a long moment she just stared at him, and he wondered if she could even speak. Then her good hand moved to her face, touching the swollen flesh gingerly. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse and broken. "Raymond, my husband. He found the money I was saving." Graham felt his hands curl into fists. "He did this to you?" She nodded, then winced at the movement. "He threw me outside, told me to freeze." "Where is he now? The cabin, I suppose." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Is he looking for me?" Graham went to the small window and peered out. The blizzard had finally stopped, leaving the world buried in white. There were no tracks, no signs of anyone searching. "No, there's no one out there." Something like relief crossed her battered face, followed quickly by something darker. Shame, maybe, or grief. She turned her face away from him. "I'm Graham Tucker," he said gently. "What's your name?" "Nora Jenkins." She paused. "Or I don't know what I am now. Right now, you're someone who needs medical attention. How bad is the pain?" "Bad." She took a shaky breath. "My ribs, my shoulder, everything really." Graham nodded. "The storm's passed. I can take you to the doctor in Goldfield. It's not far." "No." The vehemence in her voice surprised them both. "Please. Raymond will find me. He'll say I'm his wife, that I ran off, and the law will give me right back to him. You don't understand how it works." But Graham did understand. He'd seen it before, the way the law sided with husbands no matter what they'd done. A man's wife was his property, and interfering could get you killed or jailed, sometimes both. Still, Nora needed help he couldn't provide. "Your shoulder might be broken," he said carefully, "and you might have internal injuries. I'm not a doctor. Please." Tears leaked from her eyes, running down into her hair. "I can't go back to him. I would rather die out here." Graham stood and paced the small space, thinking. The moral thing and the legal thing were often at odds in the West, and he'd always been the type to follow his conscience over the law. Finally, he made his decision. "All right, here's what we'll do. There's a woman in town, Mrs. Patterson. She was a nurse in the war. She's discreet, and she doesn't care much for men who beat on women. I'll bring her here to look at you. Tell her you're my sister who took a fall from a horse. Once you're well enough to travel, we'll figure out the next step." "Why?" Nora's voice was small. "Why would you help me?" "You don't know me." Graham looked at her, this broken, brave woman who'd survived a husband's brutality and a blizzard, and felt something shift in his chest. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "And because no one deserves what was done to you, Mrs. Patterson." Proved to be everything Graham had hoped. She was a stern woman in her 50s with capable hands and a no-nonsense attitude. She took one look at Nora and didn't believe the horse story for a second, but she didn't press for details either. Instead, she went to work examining her patient with brisk efficiency. "3 cracked ribs," she announced after a careful examination. "Shoulders dislocated, not broken, thank the Lord. I can set it, but it's going to hurt like hellfire. Got a gash on your side that needs stitching. Frostbite on your toes, but not bad enough to lose them. You're a lucky girl." "Lucky," Nora repeated, her voice flat. Mrs. Patterson met her eyes. "You're alive, aren't you? That's more than some can say." She turned to Graham. "I'll need your help holding her down while I set that shoulder." "You got the stomach for it." Graham nodded. He'd done worse on cattle drives and in saloon fights. He positioned himself as Mrs. Patterson instructed, holding Nora's right arm and bracing her torso. The older woman counted to 3, then pulled and twisted in one smooth motion. Nora's scream was mercifully brief before she passed out from the pain. "Better that way," Mrs. Patterson said, already fashioning a sling. "Now I can stitch her up without her fighting me." Graham held Nora's uninjured hand while Mrs. Patterson worked, threading neat stitches into the gash on her side. His thumb stroked small circles on her wrist, a gesture he didn't even realize he was making. "She your woman?" Mrs. Patterson asked, not looking up from her work. "No, madam, just someone who needed help." Hum. The sound was skeptical. Well, someone beat on her something fierce. Probably a man who thought he owned her. She'll need time to heal and not just the body. You prepared for that. I'll do whatever she needs. Mrs. Patterson finished the last stitch and tied it off. She'll need to stay quiet for at least 2 weeks. Let those ribs start to knit. The shoulder needs to stay immobilized for a good month. I'll come back in a few days to check on her, bring some supplies. In the meantime, keep her warm and get some food in her. She's half-starved. After Mrs. Patterson left, Graham sat beside the cot and waited for Nora to wake. The lined shack was small enough that the stove kept it warm, and outside, the world was blindingly bright with fresh snow. He should have been thinking about his job at the Miller Ranch, about the wages he was losing by staying here, but all he could think about was the woman lying pale and still on the cot. She was beautiful, he realized, even with the bruises. There was something in the shape of her face, the curve of her mouth, the determined set of her jaw even in unconsciousness. But it was more than that. There was a strength to her, a core of steel that had kept her alive through what would have killed a weaker person. When Nora finally woke, the afternoon sun was streaming through the window, making the snow outside sparkle. She turned her head slowly, and her eyes found Graham where he sat by the stove, cooking something in a small pot. "You stayed," she said. "Did you think I wouldn't?" Most men would have. Once Mrs. Patterson was done, you could have just left. Graham ladled soup into a tin cup and brought it over. "I'm not most men. Can you sit up? You need to eat." With his help, she managed to prop herself up against the wall, though every movement clearly cost her. The soup was thin but hot, made from dried beef and some vegetables he'd found in the lined shack's small stores. Nora ate slowly, like someone who'd forgotten how food was supposed to taste. "This is good," she said after a while. "Thank you. It's just soup. It's more than that." She looked at him directly, and he saw tears threatening again. "No one's been kind to me in so long. I'd forgotten what it felt like." Graham felt something twist in his gut. "How long were you married to him?" 3 years. He was different before, or maybe I just didn't want to see what he really was. After the wedding, things changed. He drank more, got angry faster. The first time he hit me, he cried and begged forgiveness, said it would never happen again. She laughed, a bitter sound. "It happened again the next week, and the week after that, and it just kept happening until I couldn't remember what it felt like not to be afraid all the time." "Why didn't you leave?" "Where would I go? My parents are dead. I have no family, no money. Women don't have choices, Graham. We go from our father's house to our husband's house, and we're supposed to be grateful for the protection, even if that protection comes with fists and boots." Graham had no answer for that. She was right, and they both knew it. The law gave women few rights and fewer options. A woman alone was vulnerable in 1,000 ways, and society offered little sympathy for those who left their marriages, regardless of the reason. "You have a choice now," he said finally. "You're free of him." "Am I?" Nora looked out the window at the snow. "He'll look for me eventually. And when he does, what will I do? I can't run far with cracked ribs and a dislocated shoulder. I have no money, no skills except keeping house and mending. What kind of freedom is that? The kind you make yourself." Graham set down his own cup and leaned forward. "Look, I don't have all the answers, but I know you're stronger than you think. You survived him. You survived that blizzard. Whatever comes next, you can survive that too." Nora studied him for a long moment. "Why do you care, really?" It was a fair question, and Graham wasn't entirely sure he knew the answer. There was something about her that called to him, something beyond simple compassion or duty. When he'd found her in the snow, half frozen and bleeding, something in him had shifted. Like a compass needle finding true north, he'd known that saving her was the most important thing he'd ever do. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I do, and I'm not going anywhere until I know you're safe." Over the next 2 weeks, Graham and Nora fell into a routine. He hunted small game and cooked meals. She rested and healed, her bruises fading from purple to yellow-green. Mrs. Patterson visited twice more, pronouncing herself satisfied with Nora's progress and leaving knowing looks that neither of them acknowledged. They talked during those long winter days, sharing stories of their lives. Graham told her about his childhood in Missouri, about parents who died of cholera when he was 18, about the restlessness that had driven him west. He talked about the ranches he'd worked, the cattle drives he'd been on, the wild towns and wilder men he'd encountered. Nora spoke of a quieter life, of growing up in a small Kansas town, of dreams of becoming a teacher before her parents died and left her alone at 17. She'd married Raymond a year later, thinking it was her only option, and had spent 3 years slowly disappearing into someone she didn't recognize. "I used to love reading," she said one afternoon, her fingers tracing patterns on the blanket. "Poetry, novels, anything I could get my hands on." Raymond said it was a waste of time. He burned my books one day when he was drunk, said I was paying more attention to them than to him. Graham felt the now familiar surge of anger at the dead man, because Raymond was dead as far as Graham was concerned. Even if he was still breathing in that cabin, he was dead to the woman who'd survived him. "What was your favorite?" he asked, Jane Eyre. "Have you read it?" "No, but my mother used to read to me and my sister before they died." I remember liking the sound of the words even when I didn't understand all of them. Nora smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her face, made her look younger and lighter. "I could read to you if we had a book. I'd like to hear words that aren't just about pain and survival. Next time I go to town, I'll see what I can find." But going to town meant leaving her alone, and Graham was reluctant to do that. He told himself it was because she was still injured, still vulnerable, but the truth went deeper. He was starting to realize he simply didn't want to be away from her. Her presence had become essential to him, like air or water or the warmth of the fire. It was Nora who brought up the future first. 3 weeks after he'd found her, she was able to move around the lined shack without too much pain, though her ribs were still tender and her shoulder weak. The worst of winter seemed to have passed, and the snow was starting to melt. "I need to make a plan," she said one evening as they sat by the fire. "I can't stay here forever, and I can't keep taking advantage of your kindness. It's not taking advantage if I'm offering freely. Even so, you have a life to get back to, a job." "I'm sure the Millers are wondering where you've gone," Graham shrugged. "I've worked for dozens of outfits. I can find another job easy enough. But I can't. That's the problem." Nora stared into the fire, her expression troubled. "I've been thinking about it, and I don't see a good option. If I stay in Goldfield, Raymond will find me. If I leave, where do I go? How do I support myself? Taking in laundry or sewing might earn enough to keep me from starving, but barely. You could go somewhere far away. California, maybe. I hear there are opportunities for women in San Francisco." "With what money? And how would I get there safely?" Graham had been thinking about this too, turning the problem over in his mind during the long nights when he lay awake listening to Nora's breathing. There was an answer, an obvious one, but he wasn't sure how she would react to it. He took a breath and decided to risk it. "You could come with me." Nora turned to look at him, surprise clear on her face. "What? We could leave together. I've been thinking about heading down to Arizona Territory. I hear there's good ranch work down there, and it's far enough from Nevada that Raymond would never find you. You could use my name, say you're my wife. No one would question it. Graham, I can't ask you to do that." "You're not asking. I'm offering." He leaned forward, trying to find the right words. "Look, I know it sounds crazy. We've only known each other a few weeks, but I feel like I've known you longer, like I was supposed to find you that night. And the idea of just riding off and leaving you to fend for yourself makes me sick to my stomach. What if Raymond comes after us? What if he finds us? Then I'll deal with him. Graham's voice was hard. I won't let him hurt you again. I promise you that. Nora was quiet for a long time and Graham waited, hardly breathing. Finally, she spoke. I'm afraid, she whispered. Not of Raymond finding us. I'm afraid of what it means to trust another man after what Raymond did to me. I'm afraid of being weak again, of losing myself. I'm afraid that I don't know who I am without someone telling me what to do and who to be. Graham reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. Her fingers curled around his, small and strong. Then we'll figure out who you are together, he said. No pressure. No expectations. Just two people trying to make a new start. I won't tell you what to do or who to be, Nora. That's your choice to make. And if I can't be what you want, you already are. The words hung in the air between them, full of meaning neither of them was quite ready to examine too closely. Nora's eyes searched his face, looking for the lie, the trap, the hidden cruelty. But Graham had learned to be patient during his years of wandering, and he waited until she found whatever she was looking for. All right, she said finally. Let's go to Arizona. They left a week later, after Mrs. Patterson had given Nora a final examination and declared her well enough to travel. Graham had gone into Goldfield to buy supplies, half expecting to run into Raymond Jenkins, but the man was nowhere to be seen. Rumor in the general store said Jenkins had been on a 3-day drunk and was holed up in his cabin with a case of whiskey. Graham was tempted to go out there and teach the man a lesson, but Nora's safety was more important than his satisfaction. He bought horses, supplies, and a simple gold band that he slipped onto Nora's finger before they left. For appearance's sake, he said, though his heart hammered when he slid it onto her hand. She looked at it for a long moment, then nodded. Mr. and Mrs. Tucker, she said softly, it feels strange. We don't have to do this if you don't want to. No, I do. I'm just not used to choosing for myself. She met his eyes and smiled. It feels good. They rode south through melting snow and budding trees, taking their time, stopping early each day to make camp. Graham was hyper-aware of her presence beside him, the way she sat her horse with growing confidence, the way the bruises on her face faded until you had to know they'd been there to see them. She was gaining weight too, her face filling out, her body losing that starved look. At night, they slept on opposite sides of the fire, maintaining propriety even though anyone who saw them would assume they were man and wife. Graham was careful never to touch her without permission, never to crowd her or make her feel trapped. He saw the way she sometimes flinched at sudden movements, the way her eyes would go distant when she thought he wasn't looking. Healing took time, and he had all the time in the world. They talked as they rode about everything and nothing. Nora had opinions, he discovered, strong ones that she'd learned to hide during her marriage. She believed women should be able to vote and own property. She thought the treatment of the Chinese workers on the railroads was disgraceful. She had ideas about education and poverty and the way the West was being settled. Raymond used to hit me when I talked like this, she said one day as they rode through a mountain pass. Said I was getting above myself, that women shouldn't concern themselves with such things. Raymond was a fool, Graham said. I like hearing what you think. Do you agree with me? Not always. But that doesn't mean your thoughts aren't valuable. Nora was quiet for a moment. That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me. Graham laughed, surprised. That you can have your own thoughts. That they matter even if you disagree. Raymond needed me to think like him, to be an extension of him. You're saying I can be myself. Of course you can. Not of course. Nothing about this is of course, Graham. What you're doing, the way you treat me, it's extraordinary. I need you to know that. Graham felt heat creep up his neck. He wasn't used to being praised, especially not for things that seemed basic to him. I'm just treating you like a person. Exactly. They crossed into Arizona territory on a warm April day. The landscape changed from pine forests to desert scrub, from snow-capped mountains to red rock formations that glowed in the setting sun. Nora stared around her in wonder, her eyes wide. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "I've never seen anything like it." "Different from Nevada," Graham agreed. "We'll head for Prescott. It's a decent-sized town, lots of ranches nearby. I should be able to find work." But as they rode, Graham found himself thinking less about work and more about what came next. This pretend marriage that was starting to feel less pretend every day. The way his heart jumped when Nora laughed. The way he looked forward to the evenings by the fire, talking until the stars came out. The way he'd started thinking of her as his to protect, his to care for, his in ways that had nothing to do with paperwork or pretense. He was falling in love with her. Had probably been falling since that night in the blizzard, when he'd held her frozen form and willed her to live. The realization should have terrified him. He'd spent 6 years avoiding exactly this kind of entanglement, keeping his heart carefully guarded. But with Nora, it felt right. Natural. Like the other half of himself had been wandering around Nevada in the snow, waiting for him to find her. The question was whether she felt the same. They found a small ranch outside Prescott that was looking for a couple to manage it. The owner, an old cattleman named Samuel Wright, had taken sick and needed help running the place. He had a small house on the property, separate from the main ranch house, and he offered it to Graham and Nora along with decent wages. "You seem like good people," he said, looking them over with shrewd eyes. "And Lord knows I need the help. My arthritis is so bad some days I can barely saddle a horse." "You think you can handle it?" Graham looked at Nora, who nodded. "We can handle it, sir." "Good. The little house is yours. It's not much, but it's weather-tight. You can move in today if you like." The house was indeed small, just 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, but it was clean and sturdy. There was a bedroom with a real bed, a living area with a fireplace, and a pump right outside the door. Nora walked through it slowly, touching the walls, the furniture, like she couldn't quite believe it was real. "It's ours," she asked, "for as long as we work here. I've never had a place that felt like mine." She turned to look at him, and there were tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Graham. For all of this, for my life." Graham closed the distance between them, moving slowly so she could step away if she wanted. She didn't. He raised his hand and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear. "Nora," he said softly, "this hasn't been pretend for me, not for a while now. I know it's too soon, I know you're still healing, but I need you to know how I feel. I'm in love with you, completely. And if you don't feel the same, that's all right. We can still be partners, still work together, but I had to tell you." Nora's breath caught. Her hand came up to cover his where it rested on her cheek. "You love me, with everything I am. Even broken, even damaged. You're not broken. You're the strongest person I've ever met." He searched her eyes. "But I understand if you can't feel the same way after what you've been through." "Stop," she whispered. She stepped closer, so they were barely a breath apart. "Do you want to know when I started falling in love with you? It was in the line shack when you held my hand while Mrs. Patterson stitched me up. You didn't have to do that. You could have looked away, let me suffer alone. But you stayed and you held my hand, and for the first time in years I didn't feel alone." Graham's heart was pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. "Nora." "I'm still afraid," she said. "I'm afraid of so many things. But I'm not afraid of you, and I'm not afraid of this." She rose on her toes and kissed him, soft and tentative and absolutely perfect. Graham wrapped his arms around her carefully, mindful of her still healing ribs, and kissed her back. It was gentle and sweet and full of promise, a kiss that said this is just the beginning. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. "So we're really doing this?" Nora asked, a smile playing at her lips. "Really getting married?" "We're already married according to everyone else. But not really, not legally. I'm still legally Raymond's wife." Graham hadn't thought of that, and his jaw tightened. "We'll figure it out, file for divorce if we have to, or just wait. Eventually, he'll be dead and you'll be free." "Or," Nora said slowly, "we could just start over. Nora Jenkins died in that snowbank. Nora Tucker is someone new, someone free. The law might not recognize it, but we can. Are you sure? If Raymond ever found out?" "He won't. And if he does, you'll protect me. I trust you, Graham." Those words, simple as they were, meant everything. Graham pulled her close again, resting his chin on top of her head, and felt peace settle over him for the first time in years. "Then we'll start over," he said. "Together." Life on the Wright ranch fell into a comfortable rhythm. Graham worked with the cattle and horses, repairing fences and helping old Samuel with the heavy labor he could no longer manage. Nora took over the household tasks, cooking and cleaning and managing the chickens Samuel kept. But she also helped with the ranch work when she could, learning to ride better, to rope, even to help with branding when the time came. Samuel watched them with knowing eyes, occasionally making comments about how well they worked together, how lucky he was to have found them. Graham suspected the old man saw more than they tried to hide, but he never pressed, and for that, Graham was grateful. The months passed in a blur of work and stolen moments. Graham and Nora shared the little house, shared the bed, shared their lives in ways both profound and mundane. He learned that she sang when she cooked, that she had a terrible sense of direction, that she could calm even the most fractious horse with a soft word and a gentle touch. She learned that he was an early riser who liked to watch the sunrise, that he had a dry sense of humor that took her by surprise, that he had nightmares sometimes about finding her too late in the snow. On those nights, she would wake him gently and hold him until the fear passed, murmuring that she was here, she was safe, everything was all right. And in the morning, neither of them would mention it, but the bond between them would be a little stronger. By summer, Nora's injuries had healed completely. The scar above her eyebrow was barely visible, and her shoulder had regained most of its strength. But more than her body, her spirit had healed. She smiled easily now, laughed often, moved through the world with a confidence that had been beaten out of her during her first marriage. One evening in late July, they sat on the porch of their little house watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Nora's head rested on Graham's shoulder, his arm around her waist. It was peaceful and perfect, and Graham couldn't imagine being anywhere else. "I've been thinking," Nora said softly, "about making this real." Graham turned to look at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean really getting married. I know we can't legally, not while Raymond is still alive and thinks he's married to me. But there are circuit preachers who come through these parts, aren't there? Men who don't ask too many questions." "There are," Graham said carefully. "But why? We're already living as man and wife." "Because I want to make vows to you. Real ones in front of God or whoever will listen. I want to promise you the things I never meant when I promised them to Raymond. Love and honor and cherishing. Partnership. I want you to know I choose you, Graham. Every day I choose you." Graham felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I choose you too, every single day. Then let's do it. Let's make it real." A month later, a traveling preacher stopped at the Wright ranch. He was an old man with kind eyes who asked few questions, and seemed content to perform a marriage ceremony for the young couple who approached him. Samuel stood as witness, and in the golden light of late afternoon, Graham Tucker and Nora Jenkins pledged themselves to each other. The words were simple but heartfelt. Graham promised to love, honor, and protect her for all the days of his life. Nora promised the same, her voice steady and sure. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Graham kissed her with all the love in his heart, and Nora kissed him back, tears of joy streaming down her face. That night in their little house, they celebrated their marriage in the oldest way. It was Nora's first time making love without fear, without pain, and Graham was infinitely patient, infinitely gentle, showing her with his hands and lips and body what love was supposed to feel like. Afterward, she cried in his arms, but they were healing tears, the kind that washed away old wounds and made room for new growth. "I never knew it could be like this," she whispered against his chest. "I never knew I could feel so cherished." "You are cherished," Graham murmured into her hair. "More than I have words for." The years that followed were good ones. Graham proved himself invaluable to the ranch, and when old Samuel died peacefully in his sleep 3 years after they'd arrived, he left the property to Graham and Nora in his will. It wasn't a large ranch, but it was theirs, and they poured their hearts into making it successful. They hired a few ranch hands, expanded the herd, and built a reputation for quality cattle and honest dealing. Nora kept the books with a sharp eye and a sharper mind, proving herself a natural businesswoman. Graham sometimes thought about the scared, broken woman he'd found in the snow and marveled at the transformation. But he knew the truth. She'd always been this strong. She just needed the chance to show it. In the spring of 1886, Nora discovered she was pregnant. Graham's reaction was pure joy mixed with terror. He'd never thought much about being a father, but now that it was happening, he wanted it desperately. He also couldn't shake the fear that something would go wrong, that he would lose her the way he'd almost lost her that night in the blizzard. "I'm fine," Nora assured him for the 100th time, laughing at his hovering. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I'm strong and healthy, and we have a good doctor in Prescott. I know, but you're a worrier." She took his face in her hands and kissed him. "I love you for it, but you need to trust that I'll be fine. I trust you. It's the universe I don't trust." Their son was born on a cold December night, squalling and red-faced and absolutely perfect. Graham held him with shaking hands, overwhelmed by the tiny life they'd created. Nora, exhausted but radiant, watched them with a smile. "What should we name him?" Graham asked. "I was thinking James." "James Samuel Tucker, after your father and the man who gave us our start." "It's perfect." Graham carefully placed their son in Nora's arms and kissed her forehead. "You're perfect. I love you so much." "I love you too. Thank you for finding me that night. Thank you for surviving." They had 2 more children over the next 4 years. A daughter they named Rose, and another son they called William. The little house became too small, so Graham built an addition, then another, until it was a proper home filled with laughter and love and all the chaos that came with raising children. Nora was a wonderful mother, patient and kind but firm when needed. She taught the children to read from the books Graham bought her, accumulating a small library that was her pride and joy. She told them stories, sang them songs, and showed them by example what it meant to be strong and independent. Raymond Jenkins was never mentioned. As far as Graham knew, the man was still alive somewhere in Nevada, drinking himself to death in that cabin. Occasionally, Graham worried that he would somehow track them down, but as the years passed, the worry faded. They'd built a life too strong to be torn apart by the ghost of Nora's past. On their 10th anniversary, Graham and Nora stood on the porch of their home and looked out over the ranch they'd built together. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant colors, and in the distance, they could hear their children playing. "You ever regret it?" Graham asked. Leaving everything behind and starting over, Nora turned to him with the smile that still made his heart skip. "Regret leaving a man who beat me and a life that was killing me, not for a single second. I mean the way we did it, running away, the lies we had to tell. We didn't lie about anything that mattered." She took his hand and laced their fingers together. "We told the truth about love and commitment and building a life together. Everything else is just details. Still, sometimes I wonder if we should have done things differently." "Graham Tucker, you saved my life. You gave me a reason to keep breathing when I wanted to give up. You showed me what real love looks like, what partnership means. If you think I regret any of that, then you haven't been paying attention." Graham laughed and pulled her close. "I guess I haven't." "Besides," Nora continued, leaning against him, "look what we built. A successful ranch, 3 beautiful children, a real home. We did that together as equals. That never would have happened if we'd done things the proper way. You're right, as always. I'm glad you're finally learning that." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink below the horizon. In the house behind them, they could hear the children arguing about something, and the sound made them both smile. It was a good life, a full life, built on a foundation of love and mutual respect. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night?" Nora asked softly. "In the line shack, I said a lot of things that night. You said I was stronger than I thought, that I could survive anything." She turned to face him, her eyes bright. "You were right, but I didn't do it alone. We survived together. And we'll keep surviving together," Graham said, cupping her face in his hands, "for as long as we both shall live. And maybe a little bit after," Nora said with a smile. Graham kissed her then, deep and long and full of all the love and gratitude and joy that had filled their years together. When they finally pulled apart, the stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and a cool breeze was blowing across the desert. "Come on," Nora said, taking his hand. "Let's go see what the children are arguing about this time. My money's on James pulling Rose's hair. No, William definitely started it." They walked back into the house together, their laughter mingling with the sounds of their children. The door closed behind them, shutting out the night and enclosing them in the warm glow of the home they'd built. Outside, the stars continued their ancient dance across the sky, and the wind whispered through the desert scrub, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow. The ranch land stretched out in all directions, a testament to hard work and determination. And in the small house that had grown into a home, a family gathered together, bound by love and the unbreakable bonds forged in the crucible of survival. Graham Tucker never forgot the night he found Nora half frozen in a snowbank, her life bleeding out into the Nevada winter. It remained the most important moment of his life, the night everything changed. But as the years passed and their children grew and the ranch prospered, he came to see it not as the night he saved her life, but as the night they saved each other, because Nora had given him something just as precious as the life he'd given her. She'd given him a home, a purpose, a reason to stop drifting and put down roots. She'd shown him what it meant to be loved not for what he could do or provide, but simply for who he was. And in doing so, she'd saved him from a life of lonely wandering. 20 years after that fateful night, Graham and Nora sat in the same spot on their porch, older now but no less devoted to each other. Their children were grown, James working the ranch alongside his father, Rose married to a good man and living in Prescott, William studying to be a lawyer in Phoenix. The house was quieter now, but it was still filled with love. "Do you ever think about what your life would have been like if I hadn't found you?" Graham asked, his arm around his wife's shoulders. Nora was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think about it sometimes," she admitted, "but not in the way you might expect. I don't think about what I would have missed. I think about how strong I must have been to survive long enough for you to find me, how much I must have wanted to live, even when I thought I wanted to die. You've always been strong, maybe, but I needed you to see it before I could see it myself." She leaned her head against his shoulder, fitting into the spot that seemed made for her. "We made a good team, you and I. The best team." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the land they'd worked for 2 decades. In the distance, they could see James and his wife working with the horses, their young daughter riding on James's shoulders. The cycle of life continuing, building on the foundation Graham and Nora had laid. "I have no regrets," Nora said softly. "Not a single one. Everything that happened, all the pain and fear and struggle, it led me to you. And I would go through it all again if this was where I ended up." Graham kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "I love you, Nora Tucker. I loved you from the moment I saw you fighting to survive in that snowbank, and I'll love you until the day I die, and probably a good long while after that. Then I guess we're stuck with each other. I guess we are." As the stars began to appear and the desert air cooled, they remained on the porch, two people who had found each other in the worst circumstances and built something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. Their love story wasn't the easiest or the simplest, but it was real and true and enduring. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. Years continued to pass with the gentle inevitability of seasons changing. The ranch prospered under the combined efforts of Graham and James, expanding to include more acres and a larger herd. Rose gave them 3 grandchildren who visited often, filling the house with laughter and noise that reminded Graham and Nora of when their own children were young. William finished his law degree and opened a practice in Prescott, handling the ranch's legal affairs and becoming known as a fierce advocate for those who couldn't afford expensive lawyers. Nora took particular pride in her children's accomplishments, especially William's dedication to helping the vulnerable. She often said he'd inherited her sense of justice, the understanding that came from knowing what it was like to be powerless and afraid. She'd never told the children the full truth of her first marriage, but they knew their mother had a past she didn't talk about, and they respected her privacy. On a warm spring day in 1901, nearly 20 years after they'd arrived in Arizona, Nora was working in her garden when she heard a commotion from the front of the house. She straightened, wiping dirt from her hands, and walked around to find a stranger on horseback talking to Graham. Something about the man's posture, the way he sat his horse, sent a chill down her spine. Graham saw her and his expression shifted, became protective. He said something to the stranger, who tipped his hat and rode off. Only when the man was gone did Nora approach her husband. "Who was that?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "A drifter looking for work. I told him we weren't hiring." Graham took her hands and she realized they were shaking. "Nora, what is it?" For a moment I thought. She shook her head. "It's silly. I thought it might be someone from my past. Someone looking for me. After all this time, I know. I told you it was silly." But she couldn't shake the feeling, the old fear that had lain dormant for so long. That night, Graham held her close and reminded her of all they'd built, all they'd survived. "Even if someone from your past did show up, which they won't, we'd handle it together. You're not alone anymore, Nora. You'll never be alone again." His words comforted her, and the fear faded as it always did in the light of his love. But it made them both realize how much they'd healed, how far they'd come from that desperate night in Nevada. They were no longer a cowboy and a battered woman clinging to survival. They were partners, equals, grandparents, respected members of their community. The past couldn't touch them anymore. In 1905, they received word from Nevada that Raymond Jenkins had died. The news came through William, who had contacts throughout the territory and beyond. Raymond had drunk himself to death, just as Graham had always suspected he would, dying alone in the cabin where he'd once terrorized his wife. Nora's reaction surprised them both. She didn't cry or celebrate. She simply nodded and said, "I hope he found peace, whatever that means for a man like him." "You don't have to be generous," Graham said. "Not about him. I'm not being generous, I'm being free." She smiled at him, the smile that still made his heart race after more than 20 years. "He doesn't deserve my anger or my grief. He deserves nothing from me. But knowing he's gone, that he can never hurt anyone again, there's relief in that." With Raymond's death, their marriage became legally legitimate. They could have filed paperwork, made it official, but they decided there was no need. They'd been truly married since that day with the traveling preacher, as far as they were concerned. The law's recognition changed nothing. Their 50th wedding anniversary, counting from the day the preacher married them, fell on a beautiful September day in 1906. Their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch, now one of the most successful in the territory. Arizona had achieved statehood in their lifetime, something that filled them both with pride. They'd helped build this place, had watched it grow from territory to state. At the celebration, James stood and raised his glass. "To my parents," he said, his voice carrying across the crowded room. "Two people who showed us all what real love looks like, what partnership means. Who taught us that where you come from doesn't matter as much as where you're going and who you choose to travel with." Everyone drank to that, and Graham looked at Nora with moisture in his eyes. She squeezed his hand under the table, and he squeezed back. Their own private communication that needed no words. Later, when the party had wound down and the grandchildren were sleeping and the house was quiet, Graham and Nora walked out to their favorite spot on the porch. They moved slower now, their joints stiff with age, but they still fit together perfectly, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting where it belonged. "We did good," Graham said softly. "Didn't we? We did better than good. We built a life, raised children who are making the world better, created a legacy." Nora looked up at him. "And we did it together every step of the way. I'd do it all again. Even the parts where I was difficult, especially those parts. That's when things got interesting." He kissed her forehead. "You made my life interesting, Nora Tucker. You made it worth living." "You gave me a life to live," she replied. "When I had nothing, when I was nothing, you saw something worth saving, worth loving. You were always worth loving, I just helped you see it." They stayed on the porch until the stars filled the sky, talking about their children and grandchildren, about the ranch and their plans for the future. Even in their 70s, they had plans, dreams, hopes for what came next. That was the gift they'd given each other. The belief that tomorrow was worth seeing, that life was worth living fully until the very end. Graham Tucker died peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1914, at the age of 76. He went to bed beside his wife, kissed her good night as he had every night for more than 30 years, and simply didn't wake up. The doctor said it was his heart, that he'd gone without pain, without fear. Nora grieved deeply but not desperately. She'd had 50 years with the love of her life, 50 years of partnership and joy and the kind of love most people only read about in books. How could she regret that? How could she wish for more when she'd already been given so much? She lived another 6 years, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the matriarch of a family built on the foundation of love and survival. She spent her days reading, gardening, and telling stories to the little ones who climbed into her lap. Stories about the old days, about courage and kindness, about a cowboy who'd found a woman half frozen in a snowbank and loved her back to life. On a spring morning in 1920, Nora Tucker passed away quietly in her sleep, just as Graham had. Her children found her with a smile on her face, her hands stretched out across the bed as if reaching for someone. On her nightstand was a faded photograph of her and Graham on their wedding day, young and hopeful and so very much in love. They buried her next to Graham on a hillside overlooking the ranch they'd built, under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The whole town came to pay respects to a woman who'd been beloved for her kindness, her strength, and her unwavering devotion to her family. James, now an old man himself, stood at her grave and told the gathered crowd about his parents. "They taught us that love isn't just a feeling," he said. "It's a choice you make every day. It's showing up, doing the work, choosing your partner over and over again." They chose each other from the moment they met, and they never stopped choosing each other. Rose, wiping tears from her eyes, added, "Mama used to say that the worst night of her life led to the best years. That sometimes you have to go through the darkness to find the light." She and Daddy were each other's light. The legacy Graham and Nora left behind extended far beyond the ranch or the money or the land. They left a family that understood the value of love, that knew how to weather storms together, that believed in choosing each other every single day. They left a story of survival and hope, of two people who found each other in the worst circumstances and built something beautiful from the ashes. In the years that followed, the ranch stayed in the family, passed down through generations who told and retold the story of how it all began. The story of a cowboy who found a woman half frozen in a snowbank and loved her back to life. The story of a woman who survived the unsurvivable and built a new life from nothing. The story of two people who proved that love, real love, can heal even the deepest wounds. And on quiet nights when the wind blew across the Arizona desert and the stars shone bright overhead, some swore they could see two figures on the porch of the old house, sitting close together, watching the sunset like they had for so many years. Whether it was ghost or memory or simply the enduring power of a love story well told, no one could say for certain, but everyone agreed on one thing. Graham and Nora Tucker had loved each other with a fierce, enduring devotion that transcended death itself. They'd built a life together from nothing, had created beauty from tragedy, had shown everyone around them what real love looked like. And that love, that legacy, would endure for generations to come, a testament to the power of choosing love over fear, hope over despair, and tomorrow over yesterday. They'd proven that it was never too late for a new beginning, that the worst moments could lead to the best years, that love could bloom even in the harshest winter. Their story became the stuff of family legend, told around dinner tables and campfires, embellished and expanded with each telling but always maintaining the essential truth. That Graham Tucker had found Nora Jenkins bleeding in a snowbank on a frozen February night, and in saving her life, he'd found his own purpose. And she, in choosing to survive and choosing him, had saved him right back. It was a love story for the ages, set against the backdrop of the Wild West, built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine partnership. A story that reminded everyone who heard it that love wasn't just romance and passion, though Graham and Nora had plenty of both. Love was also showing up day after day, doing the hard work, choosing your partner even when it wasn't easy. The Tucker Ranch still stands today, over a century later, still in the family, still thriving. And on the porch of the main house, there's a plaque that tells the story in brief. Founded 1882 by Graham and Nora Tucker. Built on love, sustained by faith, enduring through generations. But the real story, the full story, lives on in the hearts of those who understand that the greatest love stories aren't the ones that come easily. They're the ones that are forged in fire, tested by hardship, and proven through the choice to love, honor, and cherish through all the days of your life. Graham and Nora Tucker lived that story. They were that story. And their love, begun on a desperate winter night and sustained through decades of joy and sorrow, triumph and challenge, remains a shining example of what love can be when two people commit fully to each other and to the life they're building together. In the end, isn't that what every love story is really about? Two people finding each other against all odds, choosing each other despite the obstacles, and building something together that's greater than either of them could have created alone. Graham and Nora did exactly that, and in doing so, they left behind a legacy that continues to inspire everyone who hears their tale. A legacy of love, survival, and the unshakable belief that tomorrow can be better than today, as long as you face it together with the person who holds your heart.